Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Ola talofa lava, bula venaka, etc., etc. Hey, welcome to another week together, and I hope you're all doing well. We're going to get into our subject matter for today almost immediately, but I just want to bring to your attention we've got couples conference happening at the end of August. Got our contract signed up. Fingers crossed. Really hoping that it goes ahead and that the fake virus stuff doesn't get in the way and impede us coming together. So check out the website and lock in that date for you and your spouse, your partner. The last weekend of August it is, and I cannot remember the dates. I think it's like 28, 29, 30, something like that. Anyway, check that out. Please lock it in. We're going to have a great time together. I'm going to work through some really pertinent issues for relationships and even take it from the context of where we are in our world at the moment with coronavirus. Alrighty, so we're going to have a time in prayer, time of silence, and then we'll get into our subject matter for today. Let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who've sinned against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Let the church say amen. Alrighty, so as you all know, we've been working through our Finding Truth series. We are coming near to the very end of it. Thank goodness, some of you are saying. As you all know, we've been working through these questions and processing these questions and unpacking these questions as we think about truth, as we think about what truth to follow. If there is multiple types of truth, how do you figure out what truth is? And then getting some real strong support and evidence to build the confidence around that idea. And our Forensic Faith series in our cell groups has been helping us really solidify that thinking. And last week we talked about the birth and parentage and the length of ministry and of the founders of the five largest religions of the world. And we also looked at how the life and the lifestyle of those founders matched or aligned with the teachings that they espoused. And we concluded that when it came to birth and parentage and the length of ministry, the founders were at one end of the spectrum and Jesus was on a very distant opposite end. He lagged far behind the other founders by hips and hips and hips. And yet when it came to congruency of life versus teaching, Jesus lived a life that was in complete and perfect harmony with what he espoused and taught his followers. So again, we'll see as we try to draw this stuff together, we can see that in some areas Jesus was at the top end of it in terms of a scorecard. In other areas, Jesus lagged far behind. The founders of the other faiths were miles and miles ahead. So we're going to look at one more area of the founders' lives before we wrap this all up in our final episode next week and just pull all these threads together and create one big picture to help you encapsulate and see where we have been journeying these last several weeks. And so today we're going to look at the deaths of each of the founders and what followed afterward. And a person's death and how people react to that person's death speaks volumes regarding that person's impact on the world around them. And you can just think about even attending a funeral of a loved one and the people you would see there that you may not expect to see there or may not have realized, or that loved one had an influence on, or had been in a relationship with, building a friendship with, and that sort of thing. And when you hear people would step forward to the microphone and share their story, their experience of that loved one, clearly you can see that even in the smallest of locale, that loved one had an impact on those people, and including yourself. So, you just think in terms of big scale, like global, no, don't use the word global, in terms of a world scale, you just have to think about people like John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., think Princess Diana. Almost every human being who saw or heard about the deaths of these people remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing, except for George Bush Sr. when it comes to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Anyway, we will leave that alone. And most remember, with regard to these three people and others of significance in that inverted commas, remember how the world reacted to these people's deaths. And and so what we want to do today is ask the question, well, how about the deaths of the founders of the 5 major religions? What kind of response, what kind of reaction did their deaths incite with their followers? So let's look firstly at Hinduism, and we'll look at a quote from Subha Pandit. He says, "The Hindu masters and sages were revered and held in high esteem. At the culmination of their lives, they and their families were widely praised and honored for the blessing they had brought to the community. Their deaths were regarded as significant losses to be lamented over for generations, as their lives were recounted over and over again. The masters of themselves passed on the baton of religious thought with flair, as each expanded upon the labors of their predecessors." So after their deaths, the masters and sages were cremated. So post-death, they were cremated, and there followed great mourning or even great celebration with feasting. And their ashes would then be spread over that holy river in India, the river Ganges, and that was symbolic of their merger with the eternal. And they would also erect many shrines. There's about millions of shrines and memorials across the world that were erected for their honor. So clearly there was quite an impact that the death of the Hindu founders, authors, writers, masters, sages, gurus had on their people. What about Buddhism? Let's look at Buddhism. So Gautama Buddha was surrounded by his disciples at his death, and they described his death in such manner. When the sage entered nirvana, so the sage is Buddha, entered nirvana, the earth quivered like a ship struck by a squall, and firebrands fell from the sky. The body was wrapped in 1,000 layers of finest Benares cloth, and he was cremated. Excuse me. For some days after his death, that's the Buddha's death, they worshipped the relics, so they worshipped the ashes with utmost devotion. They divided them into 8 parts, one they kept for themselves. So we're talking here about the disciples. The 7 others were handed over to the 7 kings, and those kings erected in their capital cities stupas or memorial mounds for the relics. So clearly we have again this real awe-inspiring reaction, this response to Buddha and his death, and such a celebratory death at that with regard to Buddha, very similar to the Hindu founders. Okay, what about Judaism? So as you know, we looked at Moses being that founding, as the founder of Judaism, and what was Moses' situation like? Well, Moses' death had a little bit of controversy about it, and we see that in this passage here. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land. So we're talking about the promised land here, the Canaan land, Gilead as far as Dan. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob," where he said, "I will give it to your offspring." So Moses is looking at the promised land. He is surveying the promised land as he stands on Mount Nebo, and he surveys that, and he's opposite Jericho. So he's probably looking from across the Jordan River to the promised land. And this is the Lord's then next words to Moses: "I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. All right, so there we go. We've got a little bit of controversy here. Moses is not going to make it over. And you can actually do some research on that for yourself and discover why Moses was not permitted to enter into the promised land. So further on in Deuteronomy in the same chapter, it says this: "Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended." So for 30 days, for an entire month, all of Israel wept for Moses. So there was a national mourning. The flag was at half mast, if there was a flag. Probably wasn't. No, there wouldn't have been. But you get the idea. Everyone's walking in a very solemn state as they mourned the loss of their national leader who had led them for 40 years. So what about Islam? What's the situation of Islam? Muhammad's death was even more controversial than Moses' death. And let me show you some of these quotes here. "And if he, Muhammad, had forged a false saying concerning us, we surely should have seized him by his right hand or with power and might, and then certainly should have cut off his left artery, his aorta." So what the Quran is saying here in Surah 69, 44 to 46, and this is one particular translation, and there's a number of translations, and they all say a very similar thing, is that the people were saying that if Muhammad was indeed a false prophet and making false statements, then they would have cut him off, they would have killed him, and they would have severed his life artery, his aorta, that main blood vessel that connects to the heart. So there's the test with regard to Muhammad's truthfulness as a prophet, that he would not die in such a way that his left aorta, that his life artery, his aorta, was cut. So let me read here from Sahih al-Bukhari. "The Prophet in his ailment in which he died used to say, 'O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison.'" So we've got a little bit of controversy here, because in the Quran it says only a false prophet would find their artery, their life artery, cut off. But here we've got the prophet saying, it feels like my aorta is being cut off from the poison. So we have an indication here that the test around Muhammad's truthfulness is being failed, and that he is presenting himself as what appears to be a false prophet based on the test in the Quran. And then we also have this really interesting thing where he's feeling like his aorta is being cut by poison. So Muhammad was poisoned. So what is that about? So let's go and check this out. A Jewess presented Muhammad at Khaybar a roasted sheep which she had poisoned. Okay, so we have a Jewess. So we have a Jewish woman. A Jewish woman has presented at Khaybar a roasted lamb, a roasted sheep, which she has poisoned. The apostle of Allah ate of it, and the people also ate. So the people watching the apostle Allah Muhammad eat, and they're like, yep, he's eating, I'm eating too. He then said, lift your hands, take your hands off from eating, for the sheep has informed me that it is poisoned. Which is interesting that the sheep didn't tell Muhammad before he ate it that it was poison. The sheep told him after he ate. So maybe the sheep was conspiring with the Jewish woman. All right, so it has informed me that it is poison. Bashir al-Bara al-Ansari died. So someone died, and you can go research that yourself and get the story behind all of that someone else wrote about. So he, the prophet, that's Muhammad, sent for the Jewish woman and said to her, what motivated you to do the work you have done? She said, if you were a prophet, so here we go, we've got another test. If you were a prophet, it would not harm you. But if you were a king, I would rid the people of you. The apostle of Allah then ordered regarding her, and she was killed. He then said about the pain of which he died, I continued to feel pain from the morsel which I had eaten at Khaybar. This is the time when it has cut off my aorta. So more controversy when it comes around to the death of Muhammad. We have the test around him. He would not be a true prophet if he died by the cutting of his aorta. And then a Jewish woman poisons a sheep or a lamb, and he eats of it, and the poison cuts off his aorta. And he even makes the statement that the poison cut off his aorta. So from that evidence, you can make your own conclusion around the truthfulness of Muhammad as a prophet. And Aisha, Muhammad's 9-year-old bride, says this, I never saw anyone suffer more pain than the messenger of Allah, her husband, when she was 9 years old, Muhammad. So clearly we have here extreme controversy, some serious controversy around the death of Muhammad. And it's seen as, this is clearly a revenge killing, and it acted as a test of the truthfulness of Muhammad. Now many Muslims mourned Muhammad's death, and they flooded into the mosque, and the women beat their chests as their custom was, with regard to how sad and how grief-stricken the followers of Muhammad were. And there were successors or caliphs that continued the legacy of Muhammad after his death. So in the aftermath of Muhammad's death, there were raised up other caliphs, other successors who followed him, and who hoped to continue, Islam hopes to continue even to today, the caliphate. And in fact, ISIS, and there's a whole story behind that, and how the US even helped fund that situation. Think Donald Rumsfeld, etc. And how even ISIS was about creating this caliphate, this new world order under the reign of in the line of succession of Muhammad. So really interesting stuff. And you can do your own research on all of that. Don't take in hook, line, and sinker everything that I'm saying. I'm not trying to bait you in any way or mislead you, but you do the work yourself and you come to your own conclusions around that. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, where do I go to begin that research? Just go to www.answeringmuslims.com, and that's a great place to start with regard to that, because they give you all the information and evidence around that. All right, so what about Christianity? So let me spend the last few minutes around Christianity, because we got even more controversy around the death of Jesus. I mean, you had a little bit with Moses, like zero with Gautama Buddha, zero with the Hindu sages, gurus, etc., and some serious controversy with Muhammad. In fact, the kind that would make him appear to be a false prophet. And so we've got Christianity like super controversial, because we're going to continue that same line, that delineate in the same direction with regard to Jesus as we had with Muhammad. So let's look at Jesus' death. And with him they crucified two robbers. Already got some controversy there. So Jesus being branded in a particular way, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So we've got a test here. We've got a test. So if you think you are God, you said you're God because you went around saying, look, you just smash it down and I'll rebuild it. You know, like you're talking like the creator God at the very beginning of time. He says, boom, you know, will it be? And it was there. So, you know, and God took 1 day to do that and 1 day to do that. You're saying you do the 10 with 3 days? Okay, so prove it now. Come down and prove it. Prove it. You come down and prove it, then boom, shakalaga, and then you're the man. You know, you're the God. We'll worship you. And so also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. We've got this test. There's this test here again. You cannot come down. You are clearly false prophet. You are clearly false God. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So even the guys hanging next to him are making fun of him, challenging him, mocking him, and clearly even they themselves are producing the same test and just chiding him and reviling him and just weaving into it, into that test, this real mockery. And you're going to wonder whether these guys were islanders and not Jews. So instead of national mourning, we have national mocking. And what's even more interesting is that this was an utter mockery and so embarrassing and so shameful, because Jesus died, hung on the cross, totally naked, and he was bleeding profusely from the lacerations on his back from the flogging he had gotten earlier, and whilst he was nailed to 2 pieces of wood with a spear that was stuck into his side, and he was mocked by a placard that hung over his head, this is the King of the Jews. And as he hung between these 2 criminals who, according to Mark, as we just read earlier, they joined in the mockery, and the soldiers at his feet were gambling for his clothes. This is utter mockery that is happening to Jesus. And to make matters worse, the Jews knew all too well the shame and condemnation and the curse that came with being hung on a tree. And Deuteronomy brings this out. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. So there you go, not a glorious death at all for Jesus. In fact, an extremely shameful death for Jesus. Jesus was condemned by those who despised him and disowned by those who followed him. And even according to this particular passage, even God condemned him in that space. So there we've got this really super controversial death for Jesus and super shameful death for Jesus. The thing is that for me doesn't make sense in all of this. This is the thing that really strikes me about this. The thing that doesn't make sense for me about all of this is not too long after Jesus died, his followers claimed that he had come back to life. And they went around telling everyone who would listen that their master was alive. And they did that at the risk of being mocked, of being rejected, of being beaten, of being tortured, and of being murdered. So 2,000 years later, we have millions and millions and millions of people, along with thousands of organizations like hospitals and schools, colleges, universities, and charities that bear Jesus' name. And unlike the other founders who died and stayed dead, or died and allegedly came back as somebody else, Jesus died and came back to life, and he did it as himself. At least this is the claim of the disciples. So we have this really interesting situation that we find ourselves in. Jesus apparently has come back to life, and he's come back alive as himself, and the disciples make this claim. So the question becomes, did Jesus come back to life? Was he raised from the dead? If we can show that Jesus did not come back to life, then Christianity is a false religion, and millions of people have been misled. And the Apostle Paul, one of the writers of the New Testament, puts it this way: now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Oh, and by the way, so is your faith. Your faith is also in vain. You have utterly wasted your time, your energy, your effort, even your belief in something that is utterly false. Because if Jesus has not been raised, then you're wasting your time. So I think it's important that we actually then therefore look at the evidence for this claim that the disciples make with regard to Jesus' resurrection. So what do we know about the resurrection? What evidence is there with regard to the resurrection? What's as Jim Warner Wallace would say, what evidence is there in the room with regard to the resurrection? So this is the evidence about the resurrection. We have these four pieces of evidence. We have that Jesus was crucified and buried. We have that the tomb was empty and no one was able to produce the body. We have the disciples who believed they saw the risen Jesus, and we have the disciples were transformed after meeting and interacting with the risen Jesus. So we have these four pieces of evidence with regard to the resurrection. So how do we explain this evidence? So let's look at these evidences piece by piece. Yeah. So let's look at the first one. Jesus was crucified and buried. So that's the first piece of evidence with regard to the resurrection. Well, we could claim that Jesus never died, that Jesus merely fainted, and once he was placed in the tomb, he made a full recovery and he was able to exit the tomb. That's called the swoon theory. There's several problems. Oh, I've gone too far. There are several problems with this idea of the swoon theory. And let me talk you through some of these. Firstly, we've got the Roman soldiers thrust a spear, they're not a knife, not a sword, but a spear into Jesus' side, the side of his torso, around where his heart is. And that alone would probably kill you, especially if you continue to hang on a cross while you're now bleeding from that area where that spear has now been just stuck up your side. So that's the first thing. We've got the spear stuck into a side. You show me a person who can survive having a spear thrown at them in their side. Good luck with that one. The second thing is the massive amount of blood loss. There are several wounds. In fact, most of Jesus' back was ripped open. There are wounds on his head, on his face, because remember he's got this thorny crown that's been shoved onto his head. He's been pummeled by the Roman soldiers during his whipping, his flogging. His hands have got, near the wrist area, they've got 6-inch nails in them, so he's bleeding from that area. His feet are bleeding. There's also his torso. So it would make it really hard for Jesus for his body to produce new blood, whilst the blood is like oozing out, or streaming, not oozing, but streaming out of his body, and that he'll be able to then somehow regain strength and recover during while he was in the tomb. And he would need enough strength to then be able to push the stone away that's on the outside of the tomb. So somehow he'd have to break the seal, because remember the tomb is sealed. So he'd have to break that seal and then somehow get his hand on the tomb and somehow push the rock from the inside with his hands flat up against it, and then maybe edge his hand around and then pull. Mind you, he's doing this while he's got all this probably still bleeding. There's all these wounds all over him, and that stone took several men to push into place. Then also he'd have to get quietly past the guards who were paid to let no one in and no one out, which mean he'd also probably have to have money to pay the guards off once he got outside. Once he moved the stone, how do you do that when a number of guys moved it in place and there's a seal there? So he'd also have to have money. So where's the money? Maybe Joseph of Arimathea left some money inside the tomb that he could then pay off the guards, or maybe Joseph of Arimathea paid off the guards. There's no record of that anywhere. Joseph of Arimathea believes himself Jesus to be dead. So that stuff just doesn't play into it at all. You've also got the blood and water that coming from the spear wound that indicated that Jesus' blood had stopped circulating for a significant amount of time. You've also then got Pilate. Pilate confirms with the soldiers that Jesus had died before Pilate will even allow Jesus' body to be released to Joseph of Arimathea. So Pilate wants to make sure and confirm that Jesus is actually dead, which is the whole spear in the side thing. So the Romans are careful to make sure that their guys stay dead, because if they don't, that looks extremely embarrassing for the Romans, and the Romans do not like to be embarrassed. They like to embarrass everybody else. So there's zero evidence to support the idea of the swoon theory that Jesus just fainted on the cross from a lack of blood, and then he woke up, recovered, and then went and pushed this massive stone out of the way and then took off. It just doesn't work. And there are no scholars whose degrees are worth framing in any space who would argue against the death of Jesus. Jesus was in fact crucified, and he did in fact die. All right, so the only way we can explain Jesus' death and crucifixion and death is that he in fact did die and was laid in a tomb. The second piece of evidence is that the tomb is empty and no one's been able to produce the body. So a couple of ways we could explain that away. Well, one, the disciples stole the body, or the Jewish leaders, they stole the body. So we've got disciples stole the body, or the Jewish leaders stole the body. Well, we've got problems with those two explanations also. The problems with the disciples stealing the body is, how would the disciples get past the troop of soldiers who were paid to stand guard all night? they were there to stand guard. Sleeping is not a good excuse because they were paid to stay awake. So they can say, well, the soldiers, they fell asleep. Well, no, they were paid to stay awake. They were not paid to fall asleep. And even if they did fall asleep, how did they know it was Jesus' disciples who came and stole the body? They're asleep. They're not awake. They're asleep. So it doesn't make sense. Were they half asleep? Were they sleeping with one eye open? Well, if you're sleeping with one eye open, you're not asleep. You're awake because you were supposed to be doing a job, and your job is to stay awake. Like some security guards around buildings. All right, so yeah, now that doesn't quite fly. Second thing is, why would the disciples remove Jesus' body after stripping him naked? Why would they do that? Why would they strip his body naked first and then remove the body? It just seems so bizarre to do that. It's like, well, how do you know Jesus' body was stripped naked before they took it out? Well, John 2:6-7 says that the linen that Jesus' body was wrapped up in, and even the cloth, the shawl that covered his face, the cloth that covered his face, that was folded up, and the linen was left behind in the tomb. Which means that whoever took Jesus' body would had to have stripped him naked, had to unwrap him, because remember, he died naked. And remember, he was wrapped up in that linen cloth. So essentially, they would remove the linen cloth, then carry out the naked body. That doesn't make sense. Grown men taking out another man's body naked. Why would you? That's sick. That's utterly sick. And there's one thing about these disciples, that they are not that kind of sick, because they go around saying that Jesus is alive. That's a different kind of sick to the sick where you unwrap a dead body and then carry it out in your hands. It just doesn't make sense at all. That's really sick. And the thing is, you're about to get caught by the guards who are just outside the tomb, whose stone you just rolled away, and they're lying there, not hearing the stone being rolled away. And you've now got they could have woken them up. So you've got limited time to unwrap the linen, take all the linen out, off, and then take the body out. So you want to get in there and get it as fast as you can. So it doesn't make sense at all that the disciples would steal the body of Jesus. It just doesn't fly at all. Well, what about the Jewish leaders? Well, why would the Jewish leaders want to steal Jesus' body? I mean, that completely defeats the very purpose of posting guards outside the tomb. What they wanted more than anything was to have Jesus' body in the tomb at least till Monday, so that way they can say to everyone, see, he wasn't the Messiah, because he said that, give me 3 days and boom, I'll come back to life, blah, 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 the temple, blah, 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 3 days. And it doesn't happen. So, and the posting of the guards at the tomb was supposed to stop the theft, not facilitate the death. These guys were not working in cahoots with the guards at all. So the conclusion we come to is that the tomb was empty, and it wasn't because someone removed the body. And to this day, no one has been able to produce Jesus' body or the remains of his body. So the only explanation we can garner for the tomb being empty is that the tomb simply was empty, and that no one's been able to produce the body. All right, so what about the disciples? The disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus. The only way you can explain away this piece of evidence is that everyone who saw Jesus alive after he died was hallucinating. The problem is that Jesus appeared to many people and many groups of people, and at different times, at many different times, which means every one of those people in those different groups who saw him at different times had to have had the exact same hallucination. And how do you do that? How do you manufacture the same hallucination across all these different groups of people? How do you do that? Here's a second piece that doesn't make sense. Not everyone expected or even embraced the idea of Jesus coming back to life. Classic example, Thomas. The disciples say, hey, look, we saw Jesus. Thomas wasn't present. Thomas says, you know what? Unless I see him and unless I touch the scars, I cannot believe you. So Thomas is not expecting Jesus to come back to life. In fact, the disciples weren't expecting Jesus to come back to life. No one was expecting that. So that goes to evidence that the body was, that they didn't see the body either. So again, the disciples were expecting it, and they were very skeptical about the idea of Jesus coming back to life. And anyway, it still doesn't explain the body not being in the tomb. So what do we conclude? Well, because of the multiple sightings by multiple groups of people, we have to conclude that these people did not hallucinate, but in fact did see the risen Jesus. All right, so what about this? The fourth piece of evidence. The disciples were transformed after meeting and interacting with the risen Jesus. The only way you can explain this differently would be that the disciples and everyone else agreed to fabricate a lie. There's passages in the last piece. There were over 500 people who at one time saw Jesus. So we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who have seen the risen Jesus at this time. So the biggest problem with this kind of an explanation for this evidence is that people don't get rejected, they don't get beaten, they don't get tortured. So think roasted in a large brass bowl or boiled in a large cauldron of oil. They don't get murdered, think beheaded, think crucified. People don't go through any of these to propagate a lie. People don't die for a lie. People die for the truth. They won't die for a lie. They will prefer to stay alive. In fact, they would lie to stay alive rather than lie to die. So it does not make sense for people to die for a lie. It's irrational, it's illogical. You have to be illogical, you have to be unreasonable to believe that and to have that in your mind. So it seems then that the best explanation for the evidence is that Jesus came back to life a few days after he died. And if he came back to life, then like Paul's statement quoted earlier said, we too who believe in Jesus will come back to life after we die. And that's what makes Jesus' life, death, and resurrection such good news. We who believe in Jesus have a hope that is deeply grounded in the evidence from a well-attested source, the New Testament. And the New Testament writes in there that death is not the end for those who believe in Jesus. And I want to leave you with that, family, and suggest to you that in the midst of what's going on in our world today, we have this hope, and that hope is certain, and it's certain because it's based on evidence, and that evidence is irrefutable because we just tried to refute it, and it's irrefutable. And you can do your own research on that. There's a whole bunch of people who have done some fantastic research on that, and you can go and check that out. Subha Pandit, you've got Jim Warner Wallace, you've got Frank Turek, etc., Frank Rapati, who've done some fantastic research and brought a whole lot of evidence to bear. Lee Strobel has done some great work in that area too. Ravi Zacharias, etc., done some great work that can give you this secure evidence that Jesus did in fact come back to life, which means that other things that Jesus said in the New Testament are going to happen also. Have a blessed day, have a blessed week. We'll catch you next week when we wrap up our series. Ciao.